We are honored now to have Senator Nikil Saval from Pennsylvania to join us this afternoon for the keynote presentation, Critical Responses and Structural Solutions to the Housing Crisis in Deindustrialized States. His presentation will focus on how the architecture and design community plays a crucial role in the vision of a more equitable, habitable, and beautiful world, and how their efforts can contribute to the well-being of housing occupants and users. This keynote presentation is co-sponsored by our partner, AIA Pennsylvania. Take it away, Senator Saval.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nikil Saval, and I represent the residents of the 1st Senatorial District in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. It is an honor to be here speaking with you. So my district in Pennsylvania includes Center City, Philadelphia, the downtown, and stretches through the surrounding communities, encompassing some of the most well-resourced communities in our city and state, as well as those that have experienced extreme disinvestment and high rates of poverty. Today, I'm here to talk about the housing crisis as it exists in Pennsylvania overwhelmingly, but also Illinois, and as it reverberates throughout other states that are broadly part of what we might call the industrial Midwest or deindustrializing sort of states. When I ran for office, an important part of my platform was to advance legislation that would enshrine housing as a right for everyone in our Commonwealth. We know that many of the public health problems, for example, experienced in our cities and rural communities alike have a shared root cause in a scarcity of housing that is secure, safe, comfortable, and most of all, affordable. Being with you this afternoon is a particular delight to me for a few reasons, not the least of which is my own personal interest in design, especially in this capacity. Before coming to office, my background was predominantly as a writer and as a labor organizer, and these two realms merged in, as it were, when I wrote my book, Cubed, A Secret History of the Workplace. The initial impetus for this book was my interest in the history of the office, vis-a-vis the history of just office work. But it quickly became apparent to me that office work and office design were thoroughly intertwined. A lot of the work that my staff and I are focused on now in my office is in response to Pennsylvania's housing crisis. We hear frequently about the pandemic's role in this crisis, but as I'm sure many of you know, this crisis predates COVID by many decades. Many of the problems we see now have deep roots in, for example, redlining, the practices by which policymakers throughout all levels of government suppressed Black and brown people and communities by dictating where they could live, what resources they could access, and how they could care for their neighborhoods. Before the pandemic, more than half of renters in Philadelphia were paying more than they could afford for the housing. More than 4,400 Philadelphia households did not have stable housing, and women of color suffered the highest rates of eviction and the greatest housing cost burdens. Our housing crisis is also layered. Atop the systemic, pervasive racism, we have depressed wages, high utility burdens, especially for low-income households, and a climate crisis entwined with our built environment that grows more deadly each year. We won't ever be able to solve our housing crisis without addressing all the causes of it simultaneously. We can't simply pick one of them one at a time. Recognizing that the housing crisis is inextricably interwoven with all of these factors, we need solutions that make our world more equitable, more resilient, and more beautiful. The housing community that all of you are a part of is a key component for success in this work. I look forward to mapping out the intersection of policy with development, planning, architecture, and so many other arenas that hold the skill and ability to make a sea change so that we are meeting the necessary goals for sustainability and creating a built environment that is resilient and economically viable for all of us. So first, I'm going to start with a kind of overview of what we're going to talk about today. We'll have 3 parts. The first is just what the problem is. What is our housing crisis? Then we'll get to how we respond and how in particular our office has been responding, and then what comes next. So first of all, let's look at the housing crisis. So until housing is a human right, truly a human right, a resident's annual income is often one of the most important considerations in crafting housing policy that addresses everyday concerns. So let's talk about the term cost burden and severely cost burden, which people may be familiar with. People are considered cost burdened when a third or more of their income goes to housing. And they're considered severely cost burdened when they spend more than half their income on housing. Households that are severely cost burdened and poor are more likely to sacrifice other necessities, including healthy foods and medical care, to pay the rent. And they're also more likely to experience unstable housing situations, including eviction. The total number of households who are housing cost burdened has increased substantially over the past 2 decades, rising from 31 million to 38 million households from 2001 to 2017. That means, and those numbers of course are a few years old, but that nearly a third of all US households are cost burdened. Renters make up approximately a third of all households, and many more renter households than owner households are faced with affordability problems. Nearly half of all renters in the US are cost burdened. Cost burden is an issue everywhere, and it isn't limited to urban areas. When we hone in on the experiences of lower income residents, Pennsylvania and Illinois have many similarities. So these data from the National Low Income Housing Coalition show that both states have the same proportion of renter households with extremely low incomes. And we can see as well that among these households, a large majority are severely cost burdened. Both states also have a large deficit in the number of rental homes that are even available for renters with extremely low incomes. Financial pressures can vary greatly by state, but in both Illinois and Pennsylvania, more renters than not report lost employment income in the first quarter of this year. And then when we look at the proportion of renters who are behind on their housing payments, we again see similar numbers. And we see similar hardship among renters throughout the states of the industrial or deindustrializing states of the Midwest, starting in New York and moving across Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, and even towards Wisconsin and Minnesota. So, much of the the way that we create affordable housing is through a system that a lot of architects and developers may be familiar with, which is the low income housing tax credit, or often referred to as LIHTC by its abbreviation. LIHTC was created by President Ronald Reagan, through the Tax Reform Act of 1986. It operates by raising money from investors who get tax breaks in exchange for pumping funds into affordable housing projects. It is rooted in the premise, and of course widely held in the Reagan years, that the private sector is better equipped to produce and manage affordable housing. The public sector role in this, guys, is limited to providing the minimum viable subsidy for a project to succeed. The result is a decentralized system of affordable housing development carried out by an amalgamation of private, nonprofit, and public actors. We won't go into this kind of flow chart, but this just gives you a sense of the level of complication that is involved in a LIHTC deal. LIHTC, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many policymakers, leaves much to be desired. It is, for example, an indirect subsidy. It's not a direct form of a grant. It has high overhead. It requires many expensive lawyers and consultants to put deals together. It isn't really very much of a deep enough subsidy, and LIHTC renters can still experience a cost burden. Unfortunately, it's one of the only tools available. It is a huge industry. And so, the other kind of risk is that when projects expire, which happens in various states to varying degree, over certain kinds of timeframes, but there is a risk that they will convert or lose their subsidy and convert to market rate. So this quote from Nora Lichtash, she's a affordable housing developer here in Philadelphia, refers to it as a backwards program. It should be a program where tax dollars subsidize housing, and instead we subsidize tax lawyers who get paid $700 an hour to ensure their clients get the full benefit of the tax credit. So, now let's talk about how we respond. And I'm going to talk a little bit about our own housing agenda here in Pennsylvania. So we sort of divide our thinking about our housing policy into 2 buckets, essentially. The first would be critical responses. These are short-term interventions to mitigate human suffering caused by a deeply unjust system. And here we've listed 3 things: rental assistance, eviction ceiling, and fair chance housing, and I'll describe each of these things. Then we also have things that we can call structural solutions. So the first would be whole home repairs or deep retrofits of our existing housing stock, and the other is social housing, and we'll get into that as well. So first, let's talk a little bit about rental assistance. So rental assistance is an attempt to address an eviction problem that, of course, predates the pandemic. 95% of evictions in Philadelphia take place because residents simply don't have enough money to cover their rent. This could be because they have low-paying jobs and or because of the overwhelming loss of affordable units, a low affordable inventory. Philadelphia has had a very simple in some ways, but very significant success in dispersing federal rental assistance, an approach that is getting national attention. It required essentially a couple things. One is that a real investment in public servants in administrative capacity to make sure that our rental assistance program works. We have dedicated people who are committed to getting money out the door. And it's, of course, every program could be better staffed than it is, but is well staffed by comparison with many other programs. In addition, it has, and I believe Cook County has the same thing, an eviction diversion program, which requires landlords to apply for rental assistance prior to filing for an eviction. So as I mentioned, Cook County has a similar program at the beginning of this month, targeting people who have active eviction cases the first time they appear in court. Through this program, eligible tenants are informed about rental assistance and given help completing the application. Because non-payment of rent is such a common reason that tenants are evicted in Philadelphia, and because landlords are now required to participate in the rental assistance program prior to filing an eviction case in court for non-payment of rent, there is reason to believe that Philadelphia may be the first city in the nation to have put the tools in place to eliminate evictions caused by poverty. To this end, and building on this model, I'm introducing legislation here pictured that would expand this creative policy solution, one of the best policy solutions, I believe, to come out of the pandemic, to expand this policy solution across the state. In Pennsylvania, Philadelphia County is by far the most successful in the state at distributing rental assistance money, while other counties have struggled to get the funds to the residents who need them. I'm working with Senate leadership to advance this legislation, which would require landlords to apply for rental assistance ahead of eviction and would offer protections to homeowners by ensuring that mortgage servicers are informing borrowers of programs to prevent foreclosure. We would love this to become a permanent fixture in Philadelphia and hopefully Pennsylvania. And to do so, we'd have to untether some of the provisions in the eviction diversion program and investments in rental assistance from the pandemic. In other words, create a permanent form of rental assistance. Next, I'd like to talk about legislation that we'll soon be introducing, which we're calling the Fair Records for Renters Act. And this is basically about sealing certain kinds of eviction records. So eviction filings are, it's interesting, they're included in the data sets that tenant screening services rely upon to carry out background checks required by landlords. Basically, if you have an eviction filed against you, it ends up in a data set, and these are the data sets that are commonly used by landlords, even if you don't have a judgment against you. The filings mark renters for years and even decades, regardless of whether or not they were actually evicted. Now, let's just think about evictions for a moment. Evictions are inherently violent acts. They're violent in the moment, displacing families from their communities and children from their schools, and even causing households to lose their possessions. And that violence disrupts the health and well-being and financial stability of a family for generations, with eviction filings making it difficult for families to obtain safe, affordable housing. Eviction sealing legislation, Fair Records for Renters, functions by making sure that eviction records are sealed unless the tenant is actually evicted. Because of this, eviction sealing is really a matter of fairness, and I plan on introducing this very soon. This legislation keeps filing data out of tenant screening data sets until the court issues a judgment, protecting tenants from being penalized based on unfounded allegations or because of punitive or retributive actions by their landlord. And I believe this past spring in Illinois, Governor Pritzker signed the COVID-19 Emergency Housing Act, which established eviction ceiling provisions for cases filed before and during the pandemic, and which prohibits tenant screening companies from reporting sealed eviction records. This ensued after months of work by advocates and organizers that secured this win. And we would love to repeat that success on a more permanent basis here in Pennsylvania. Finally, I'd like to talk in terms of our critical solutions around fair chance housing. Let's just take the situation we have with our criminal justice system here. The United States is the most incarcerated country on the planet. The number of people incarcerated in state and federal prisons has quintupled since 1980. It is estimated that 1 out of every 3 US adults has been arrested by age 23, and as many as a third have a criminal record. Some 650,000 Americans return from prison each year, ready to rebuild their lives for the sake of their families and communities. But people with arrest and conviction records are routinely blocked from employment, housing, and educational opportunities by punitive legal restrictions at all levels of government. Fair chance housing is an important tool in preventing a prison sentence from becoming a life sentence. Following the lead of Seattle, Washington, San Francisco, and Richmond, California, our fair chance housing legislation, which we've introduced, will prevent landlords from running criminal background checks on prospective tenants. This legislation amends the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act by prohibiting housing discrimination on the basis of an arrest or conviction record. This does 2 things. First, it prohibits discrimination. A person's brush with the law can easily turn into an accidental life sentence that impacts their ability to be housed for decades after they have served their time. This bill will make screening for criminal records a form of unlawful discrimination. Second, it expands renter protections. Tenants with criminal records and tenants whose household members have criminal records would be legally protected from discrimination and unjust eviction. This means that family members can support their loved ones after they are released from prison, and that all people with criminal records who have served their time would be given a real chance to reintegrate into society. When a formerly incarcerated person has served their time, met all the obligations that were asked of them, they deserve to be freed so that they can begin the process of rebuilding their life. Fair chance housing legislation seeks to ensure that formerly incarcerated people have a fair chance at a place from which to do so, a place to call home. This legislation builds on the work of generations of community organizers fighting for housing as a human right. Now, in the way that we're responding to current elements of the housing crisis with those critical interventions as we've been describing, my team and I hope to be laying the groundwork for legislation that can change our structures. And our focus this fall, and in legislation that we hope to introduce in the months to come, is on home repairs, with the understanding that for many people, the most affordable option for them is the home they already have. And we want to make it possible for them to stay in their homes safely, healthily, and comfortably for now and for the long term. We've seen devastating flooding this year and in the decades to come. An additional 1.2 million residential properties are at serious risk of flooding. This is weather for which our residences in Illinois and Pennsylvania are woefully ill-equipped to withstand. Pennsylvania, as you can see here from this kind of map of renter households living in pre-1970 units, Pennsylvania has some of the oldest housing stock in the nation. And of course, much of Illinois and other parts of the Midwest have a similarly large share of aging housing stock. Hotter and wetter weather mean that homes will experience more damage from floodwaters, leaky roofs, and mold. At the same time, residents will be faced with exorbitant costs just to keep the lights on and their homes warm in the winter and cool in the summer. And greenhouse gas emissions from our built environment accelerate the pace of climate change, perpetuating a cycle of hardship borne by all, but disproportionately harming those who have the least. Climate change for Pennsylvania means that the weather we expect will become hotter and wetter with greater extremes in temperatures and in amounts of water, flood, or famine. PA ranks third in the nation for housing built before 1960 that lies within the combined floodplain. Approximately 47% of housing units this age are in the floodplain. And between 1985 and 2010, the volume of precipitation falling during severe weather events increased by more than 70%. The Midwest is facing similar projections. Illinois is also getting hotter and wetter according to both lower emissions projections and higher emissions projections. We need to tailor our home repair programs in Pennsylvania and throughout the United States to address 21st century problems. This means structuring repair programs to take a whole home approach, rather than looking at weatherization and energy efficiency issues separately from basic systems or emergency repairs required to bring units up to code. Ensuring adaptive modifications funding remains a top priority because features like grab bars, extra wide hallways, or entry-level bedrooms truly are a basic system for many of our neighbors. And setting trainees and workforce development providers up for success by providing cash stipends so folks can meet their basic needs while enrolled in job training programs. Adaptive modifications, we believe, should be seen as a basic system. In 18% of extremely low-income renter households, one adult member of the household has a disability. Although there is a high demand for affordable and accessible housing, fewer than 200,000 units in the United States are considered universally accessible, and only a fraction of those units is affordable. As of 2011, which is still a few years ago, just 3.5% of all homes had these basic accessibility features. Finally, we should consider not just the supports for our existing housing stock, but some form of addressing new construction. While retrofitting would help us move closer towards reducing the amount of greenhouse gas emissions emitted by our existing residential housing stock, we still need to address the problem of supply. And here I believe European models provide guidance. In an American context, this means changing the low-income housing tax credit. What I believe is in a vision, and my vision for American social housing, is to move away from LIHTC as a credit program and towards a direct grant-making program, so subsidized construction directly. In a way, this wouldn't change much for affordable housing developers themselves. It would require competitive bidding for grants administered by state and local housing agencies. And it would prioritize, in my view, it should prioritize projects designed to address 21st century problems. These include 1, sustainability, low carbon or net zero building materials, and high energy efficiency, which would lead to lower energy costs for buildings and for residents. 2, resiliency, designing for a hotter, wetter future. For example, we might not want electrical service or HVAC systems in basements that flood and will increasingly likely to flood. And we need renewable energy to mitigate grid precariousness, and we need better batteries and more solar. Finally, 3, we need to meet stronger affordability goals. We need alternatives to market-based solutions and minimum viable subsidy models. In other words, we need massive public investments. Finally, I think we need deep affordability, and this may look at something that the Biden administration has proposed, which is making what was formerly known as Section 8, the Housing Choice Voucher Program, an entitlement for all eligible residents. I view this time today as part of a much larger conversation that I'm very excited to be part of, and that I'm excited for all of you to be part of too. So thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this discussion. I'm glad to be in it with you and all the members of AIA Illinois. Thank you so much.